So just there's like the early imperialist expansion.
So is this okay, all right,
Yeah.
staff?
No, let me see. Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Thank you, thank you. And here's your mic.
Okay.
So in our class today, we plan to take our conversation through 4 moments. The first moment, the early 19th century. The second moment, the period after the Civil War and industrialization. The third moment, the New Deal. And the fourth moment, the war economy. John?
So we'll go back and forth, but I'll start off with the antebellum era. And one of the points that I want to make is that the United States from the early republic through arguably yesterday was imperial. It was an empire, or it wanted to be an empire, meaning there was a quest for the expansion of territory, initially fueled by slaveholders before the war, and after the war fueled by industrialists because of overproduction and the rise of industrialization. And this was a model inherited in large part from British as an empire, meaning that an empire lacks real borders. So the first large imperial acquisition, in one sense, was the Louisiana Purchase. It was by far, you get a sense of the significance of the Louisiana Purchase just by the map. It coincided with the invention of the cotton gin. Jefferson spearheaded the movement for the Louisiana Purchase, and it would lead to the forced removal of indigenous people and the emergence of the United States as the world's largest slave society at a time in which most other nations were abolishing slavery. Slaveholders and allies in the antebellum period waged a number of rebellions in their quest to create this slaveholding empire that they hoped to spread across the entire hemisphere. They made war on Mexico, which had abolished slavery, created a slaveholding Republic of Texas. In 1845, the United States annexed Texas as a slave state, which led to the Mexican-American War 3 years later. The territories acquired from Mexico at the end of the war increased America's size by 1/3. Here's a map showing the Republic of Texas as an independent republic. So all of the pink had already been established by the Missouri Compromise and much earlier settlements, and all these unorganized territories this is 1844. But Southerners wanted all of the new territories acquired for slavery, regardless of how far north they were or not. The slaveholders and their allies also sought to expand their empire into the Caribbean and other parts of Central America. In this effort, they actually failed. 3 American presidents, Polk, Pierce, and Buchanan, tried in vain to annex Cuba, a colony of Spain that generated huge wealth from slave-grown sugar. Private militias, who were known as filibusters, funded by slaveholders, invaded Cuba, Nicaragua, and northern Mexico, also in hopes of acquiring more land for slavery. Their efforts also failed. And this cohort of Southerners, similar to the Northern imperialists after the war, it's a tiny percentage of the population. In 1850, slaveholders constituted only 1% of the U.S. population. And the number of slave owners who owned more than 10 enslaved people constituted 0.3% of the population. So it was a tiny percentage, but they were by far the wealthiest Americans. They led the effort to colonize indigenous people and to use their land for slave labor. Here's a map that shows all of the slave states and what the settlement after 1850, in which California, all of the southern land, from the war on Mexico, the Louisiana Purchase, almost all of that goes for slavery. It's slave territory. California, which is a huge state, enters the Union as a free state as part of a bargaining with anti-slavery Northerners, and because California enters the Union as a free state, and in 1850 leads a number of 7 delegates from 7 deep South states hold a secession convention in 1850, in large part because California enters as a free state. And here's a map showing the free state territory and the slave state territory in the wake of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The Louisiana Purchase, as I said, was the greatest territorial expansion in the nation's history, and it coincided with the cotton gin. Slaveholders, as I said, made up only 1% of the U.S. population. They were the wealthiest Americans. It also led them to try to colonize indigenous people and use their land for slave labor. The War of the Rebellion, and so it brings essentially the aggressiveness of Southerners is what leads to the War of the Rebellion. And it led to the rise of the Republican Party. And the Republican Party was founded it's the first national party, which was founded with the central platform being an anti-slavery platform. Prohibit the spread of slavery, and that would lead to its eventual extinction. Just quit, essentially end this imperialist project, this imperialist pro-slavery project. And by limiting and prohibiting the spread of slavery, it will lead to the ultimate extinction of slavery, in which when Lincoln embraces the Republican Party, he envisions the ultimate extinction of slavery in not less than 100 years. This is in his debates with Stephen Douglas. So it's going to be a long time.
What precisely was the link between slavery and imperialism?
Because of all of these, because of trying to acquire Cuba, trying to acquire, I mean, that was all very much an imperial project.
Connected with slavery.
Connected intimately with slavery. Intimately. I mean, Southerners were really upset that they didn't acquire Cuba, because Cuba was so profitable. They wanted much more of Mexico than they got. They wanted much more of Mexico than they got. It was Southerners who were the ones who essentially made war on Mexico during the Mexican War. So it was because they understood, one is they were the true conservatives. The rest of Western culture was abolishing slavery. And so by 1850, the United States was the largest slave society in the world. The only other slave societies were Cuba, Dutch Guiana, and one other tiny place, and they were, whereas slavery in the U.S. was spreading, and slavery was by far the major part of what we now call the GNP. They were making money hand over fist, and it was a small number. It was a true oligarchy. As I said, the wealthiest Americans were without question slave owners, and they controlled the most of the wealth and ultimately a good part of the politics. And so in contrast, the North was an artisanal economy, which we've already mentioned. which was the idea that an independent artisan or entrepreneur. And the understanding it was much more of a democratic sensibility, small d democratic sensibility, in which no matter how poor you came from, if you acquired a skill or a craft, you could become an independent entrepreneur or artisan. You could own your own business. And the vast majority of Northerners were successful in that, and they were farmers. They owned family farms. But you could also be a cooper, a blacksmith, or a tanner, or a lawyer, or, I mean, there are numerous different professions. But this artisanal ideal was central, almost sacred to Northerners, whereas in the South, as I mentioned, it's a kind of it's really a feudal society of, and the goal of most white Southerners who were non-slave owning was to, by hook or crook, acquire an enslaved person one way or another, and that was before even acquiring land, and then you could be on your way to eventually becoming a profitable, wealthy slave owner. That was the Southern dream. In the North, it was receiving the fruits of your own labor, having an occupation. And I'll show you in the next several slides. The North, photography was United States was the nation that fell in love with photography more than any other country. Far more photographs circulated in the United States, in part because of the Northern ideal of a portrait representing oneself at work and celebrating this artisanal impulse or instinct. And there was one of, in fact, the most popular forms of photography in the 1840s and 1850s was what's known as the occupational photograph. So you'd go into a photography studio, and you would wear the clothing and you'd bring with them materials that showed what your profession was. And you would circulate that to friends and families. And the very nature of photography as a profession was similar to other Northern occupations, in which you didn't have to, unlike painting or unlike sculpture, you didn't have to study with a master teacher. All you needed was some time and a little bit of money to experiment with the chemicals. The cameras at that time weren't expensive. And here's a bunch of occupational photographs where the sitter is showing off their occupation. Here's a female telegrapher. You see the telegraph tape. Here's a seamstress. Here's an African-American writer. Here's a lockmaker. He has a lock in his left hand and a little hammer in his right hand for locks. A cook. A blacksmith. A miner. A merchant marine. We know it's a merchant marine because of the tie and the shirt that he's wearing. A butcher. A carriage driver, a watch repairman, a fireman, surveyors. Lincoln Star, one of Lincoln's early professions was a surveyor. A messenger and writer. This is a husband and wife team. A doctor. On his left hand, he shows tools of his trade. A printer's apprentice, young Sam Clemens. And so in contrast to that, the plantation was the center of life in the South. The owner of the plantation could overrule state law. And Frederick Douglass, I think, encapsulates the nature of the Southern plantation. It's in his last autobiography, The Life and Times, where he says the plantation was a little nation by itself, having its own language, its own rules, regulations, and customs. The troubles and controversies arising here were not settled by the civil power of the state. The overseer was the important dignitary. He was generally accuser, judge, jury, advocate, and executioner. The criminal was always dumb, and no slave was allowed to testify other than against his brother. So that hopefully captures the profound distinction between North and South. So in one sense, the War of the Rebellion was less between North and South and more between the anti-slavery Northeast and the slaveholding regions of the Mississippi Valley, the Deep South. And the war totally transforms the nation. It destroys or explodes the artisanal ideal. It leads to industrialization. It turned loose a union of states into a nation state, and it creates an industrial society in the North. The war replaced artisans working in shops and slaves toiling on plantations with industrial capitalism, in which large corporations competed in global markets. And before the war, to acquire a corporate charter, you had to make a case that the fundamental purpose for this corporate charter is for the larger public good. It wasn't for making money. It was for the larger public good. So the early corporate charter was the Charles River Bridge, the bridge that allowed people to cross over between what's now Boston and Cambridge. And that was very common throughout the antebellum period. And following the Civil War, corporate charters and corporations, as a result of the industrialization that the war brings about, becomes standard. And as I mentioned, the Republican Party is founded as an anti-slavery party. It's a central platform. Following the war, the war, in a sense, transforms the Republican Party. And it transforms it into a party of championing the industrial order. It becomes an organ of financiers and industrialists who now champion wage labor, not the artisanal ideal. And it also champions imperialism, imperial ambitions that serve industrialists rather than slaveholders.
Wage labor, which had been denounced, including by Lincoln,
That's exactly
as in some sense a continuation of serfdom and slavery.
That's exactly
Huh?
right. So before the war, as Roberto just said, before the war, wage labor was seen as a kind of serfdom, as a kind of bondage. And it was very rare. It was mostly artisans who received it. I mean, Lincoln said during his debates with Stephen Douglas, when Stephen Douglas challenged him, Douglas wanted to call Lincoln an abolitionist, which meant that you not only hated slavery, you sought for its immediate end. And an abolitionist in theory also meant the advocacy of racial equality. Lincoln was anti-slavery, meaning you hate slavery, you advocate for its end, but very gradually. Essentially, it's the difference between being a revolutionary, a radical, and a liberal. Lincoln was, until the war itself, is essentially a liberal. And when Stephen Douglas in his debates pressed Lincoln about when he envisioned the ultimate extinction of slavery, Lincoln said not less than 100 years. It would have put the end of slavery in 1958. So he's not an abolitionist, but he truly hates slavery. And he also very much believed in the artisanal ideal, and he said that he believed that that every man and woman, even African American women, have the right to receive the fruits of their own labor. That's a quote. After the war, and that was this foundation, the center of the Republican Party. After the war, the Republican Party becomes the organ of financiers and industrialists who champion wage labor and imperial ambitions, who serve the industrialists rather than slaveholders. And in one sense, a few scholars have suggested that the era of Reconstruction was itself an imperial project, because Northerners go down and they try to completely remake this former slave society. Former slaves align themselves with Republicans. They gain control over government in many respects. It was a social and political revolution that few modern societies have witnessed. Blacks came to make up 7% of the U.S. House of Representatives in just a few years after they had been enslaved people. It's the highest rate of African Americans in the House or the Senate until the 1990s. And almost 800 African Americans served in southern state legislatures. Democrats suppressed this revolution only through terrorism and electoral fraud. Industrialists following the war focused chiefly on reconstructing the West. So they wanted to make the West the place where they could make money hands over fist. They waged war on indigenous people. They colonized survivors on reservations in the hopes of educating them and acclimating them to the industrial economic order. Under a Republican-led industrialists, the U.S. also acquired sovereignty over Alaska, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, Hawaii, and the Canal Zone of Panama. And it's because in a sense, these industrialists were too effective and too efficient. They overproduced goods. And so by overproducing goods, if you don't find new markets, you have to lower the cost of what you're selling your product for. And you can go bankrupt. And so by acquiring new places to sell your goods, either formally bringing them into the United States or having them being economic sovereign of the United States. That's what they did. So one example is that over roughly 90% of the railroads in Mexico were owned by, they were owned by a U.S. Company or organization that was chartered in Massachusetts. The railroads in Mexico were owned and operated, or owned by Mexico. That's one example. American imperialists were less interested in creating formal colonies than in establishing zones of authority and influence backed by the military arm of the nation state. In fact, about the American industrialists owning 80% of Mexican railroads, or more than 80%, it was the company was called the Mexican Central Railway. U.S. corporations produced far more than Americans could consume. Corporate leaders argued that they could not afford to produce less, owing to huge capital costs. America's new global markets fueled the demand for manufactured products, thus solving the problem of overproduction. This industrialization also fueled the immigration to the United States, the demand for wage labor. And that was satisfied by an unprecedented number of migrants. And in fact, just the statistics are, I think, telling. More people migrated to the United States between 1870 and 1900. In 30 years, more people migrated to the United States than the entire U.S. population of 1860. That's a huge transformation. It's a nation that looks nothing like 1860. the supply of workers gave corporations powerful leverage to control working conditions and pay. There were no protections for workers. From 1879 to 1885, there were over 3,000 strikes involving more than 700,000 workers. The U.S. had the most violent labor history of any society in the industrializing world at this time. Business leaders referred to strikes as insurrections and often called in federal troops or private militias to surpass them. Business leaders also referred strikers to soldiers who defected and should be shot. So they connected the war, the military nature of the war, to how they envisioned workers in large factories. So in a sense, from 1865 through, really through until the FDR, American elites responded to global capitalism, massive immigration, and imperial ambitions by exploiting workers and making war on non-whites at home and abroad. So there's this imperial vision for a huge swath of the post-Civil War period into the early 20th century, in which corporations now become major sources of power.
So John, I'd like to go back to an argument we had early in the course about the political economy of the early republic, and ask you to comment on it as a bridge to the discussion of the late 19th century, industrialization, immigration.
Yeah, so the best way to understand industrialization in the antebellum period is to look at the very wealthy southern planters who were, in a sense, the first industrialists. I mentioned to you earlier before we came that the wealthiest Americans by far were slave owners, and the top 10 wealthiest slave owners owned 3, 4, 5 plantations. And so in a sense it was an early form of a corporation, even though it wasn't legally a corporation, in that they hired chief operating officers to oversee each plantation, who would then report to the CEO.
Yeah. So it was a kind of industrial model of agribusiness in our contemporary vocabulary.
That's right.
With an export orientation, of course.
Very much so. The vast majority of cotton and other slave-grown products were exported to the rest of the world, especially to England, France, and Europe.
Now, I'd like to go back for a moment to the earlier argument, just to recall it. So the idea then that we brought up early in the course is that in the early republic, especially with respect to the economy of the North, this artisanal economy of small-scale proprietors and entrepreneurs, of property-owning democracy that you have described, there were two different phenomena. There was on top a national developmentalism. That's how we might describe it today. That was Hamilton's project. And the agent of that national developmentalism was an elite, a clique of politicians, diplomats, bureaucrats, entrepreneurs, adventurers. The first object was literally to open up the country, the transport network, first of roads and canals and later of railways, the national debt and the national bank were used as a financial instrument of this project of national uplift and of enrichment of this elite, which was organizing this project. And all of this was done under steep protectionist barriers.
Yes.
The United States was one of the most protectionist countries in the world up to the 1920s.
Yes.
This was very, it was only when it achieved economic ascendancy in the world that it began to lower these protectionist barriers.
Yes, that's right.
But if this were the only project of the economy of the North, the United States would not have become what it became. So the claim that I made then in that early argument is that this Hamiltonian project of national development, national developmentalism at the top, interacted with something else. And the something else was the partial and selective democratization of what were then the two crucial sectors of the American economy in the North or in the West, which were agriculture and finance. So in finance, there was the clash over the National Bank, which under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, resulted in the dissolution of the Second Bank of the United States, which was the instrument of the nascent plutocracy of the country. And the creation of the remarkable network of local banks, which the United States then developed. A bank was prohibited from operating in more than one state of the Union.
That's right.
And only at the end of the 19th century, the New York banks de facto became national banks, even before the legal prohibition was lifted. But the practical outcome of this first initiative was the creation of this remarkable network of local banks at the service of the local producer, not just the local consumer. And I think we would have to say today that this was not the regulation of the financial market and not the attempt to compensate through redistributive social spending or progressive taxation for the inequalities generated in the market. It was the reimagination of the market. It was the reconstitution of the legal and institutional framework of the market order in the sector of finance. A similar thing, or even much more far-reaching thing, happened in agriculture, the other major sector, of the economy of the North. The government distributed the public lands on the agrarian frontier through the Homestead Acts, and then it constituted the economic, legal, and institutional basis for family-scale farming with entrepreneurial attributes, right? So first, creating the framework that would allow family-scale agriculture to protect itself against the unique combination of climate risk and price risk, right? To which family agriculture alone is subject to this combination of dangers. And the historical example is that in the world, no system of family-scale agriculture has prospered for long unless it has some kind of safeguard against this combination of risks. So the Americans developed that: price supports, food stockpiles, agricultural insurance. And on the other hand, they then, through the system of agricultural extension, brought the most advanced techniques and knowledge to the door of the family farmer. Agricultural extension, this uplift of the, so that the family farmer would not just be a subsistence farmer.
Correct.
That's what made it possible
right.
for the family scale farmer to combine family scale with entrepreneurial attributes.
Yes, and so it's a main reason why in the southern states, in the slave states, the majority of people were poor, non-slave owning whites whose American dream was to own slavery, and the vast majority of them were subsistence farmers.
Yes.
unlike the North. And part of the reason for the subsistence is that Southerners were very fearful of federal power, and they refused money to create railroads and networks of roads and canals, because they recognized that if you create roads and canals and you create cities and you create a modern infrastructure, it's easier for slaves to escape.
Yes. Well, I say this because it's often implied that the United States is ideologically opposed to national developmentalism.
Right.
But the United States is itself the project
That's
or
right.
the outcome of national developmentalism,
Yes.
of this Hamiltonian project.
That's exactly right. That continues, and
And it's two parts, which is mobilization above of national resources and planning, national planning, and below selective democratization in the two sectors that were then most crucial to the economy of the North.
That's right. And the one thing I'll add about the Hamiltonian system is that Hamilton, I mean, it was from the Revolution through the 1820s, roughly. It's statesmen embraced what they call small R republicanism, which reflected a rigorous hierarchy. And that hierarchy is essentially based on previous family wealth.
Yeah.
And so if you didn't come from a prestigious or known family with wealth, the idea of rising up, starting from nothing and becoming successful, whether as a lawyer or as a doctor or whatever, was very difficult. And that shifts for a number of reasons, beginning in the 1820s. And so when Lincoln is a product of this breaking down of this hierarchical Hamiltonian system,
No.
which coincides with the
Which would have been more hierarchical were it not for this democratizing impulse coming from
Exactly.
below
That's exactly
in
right.
agriculture and finance. That's what
right.
tilted it in a different direction and made the country possible, right? Built the country
exactly right.
de facto.
That's right. In fact, the democratic impulse from below finally becomes the democratic impulse of above. I mean, it actually is crucial for democratizing the nation.
Yeah.
And one kind of characteristic of this is that the term, you all know that the idea of the self-made man is very common. It's still used a lot. In the 19th century, self-making wasn't about just having money. It was about acquiring a skill or a craft and being successful at that skill or craft, and being a person that will help build your community or your city or your state itself. The very term self-made man isn't coined until 1831, at the very moment in which this shift occurs. Yes.
Professor Unger, can you clarify the statement you made about the American ideological opposition to a national developmentalist project?
Yeah, and this is what, in the vocabulary of the 20th century, the developmentalism above, because there are two different elements. There's the elite developmentalism, right? To build the country, literally to build it physically, and then to build its main sectors. So that's what, in the 20th century, was associated with what was called developmentalism and national developmentalism, organized or orchestrated by the state. It's like what you might call a Nasserite project after Nasser of Egypt, right? And many third world countries, development countries, had this program, this project.
Where are we temporally when we say the American ideological opposition to this type of project?
Where it changed and sort of denied its own roots, or is that the question?
I guess I'm curious if you're making a critique of sort of a hegemonic neoliberalism.
No. I'm saying something more elementary, which is that the country was the product of two things: of this national elite, which took power and have this developmentalist program. That's the top thing. And second, of the tinkering with the institutional arrangements of the market order down below. That's not the developmentalism, that's something else. And that's with this populist element down below, which was to reimagine the capital market, the financial market on one side, and the agricultural market on the other. Not just to attenuate the inequalities that they generate in these markets, not just to regulate them, but to reinvent them in their legal and institutional architecture. And the claim that is being made is that it was this marriage between developmentalism above, under the aegis of the Hamiltonian ideas, and selective democratization below, which actually made the United States what it is. Even though later on, much of what came to be known in the world and in the country as the American ideology was the denial of all of that. So that last observation then leads to what I wanted to recall as the bridge to this discussion of the late 19th century, because this virtuous dialectic between national developmentalism above and selective democratization below did recur later in American history, but each time weaker than the time before. And the question is, this is the question for us, why did it become progressively weaker? And I have a hypothesis about that, an argument, which I wanted to suggest as this bridge to our debate about the late 19th century. It became weaker because of two kinds of inadequacy: the weakness of politics and the weakness of thought. Because to maintain this pressure of selective democratization below, there would have to be a real democracy with a high level of popular engagement in political life, with a rapid dissolution of impasse, so the government wouldn't be stalemated, it could have transformative projects, and its federalism would have to be an effective instrument of experimentation. So the Americans didn't do that, as the polemical argument, in the Constitution under the leadership of Madison and others. What they organized was what in today's vocabulary we might call a proto-democratic liberalism. At the beginning, it was even more elitist than it later became. There were many qualifications to the suffrage, and these qualifications were later released as the Americans discovered that they didn't need these qualifications to prevent democracy from reinventing the market order more radically. But it was what today we might call a low-energy democracy, because it maintained the people at a low level of engagement in political life. It perpetuated impasse deliberately and associated, in the Madisonian scheme of checks and balances, the liberal principle of a fragmentation of power with the conservative principle of a slowing down of politics, and it prevented the federal system from becoming what some imagined that it could become, which was a motor of experimentation to try different things out in the country and organize a national life as a kind of dialectic of national experiments. So they had locked themselves in to this weaker democracy, this elitist democracy, this discursive democracy of Madisonian notables, which helped prevent the continuation of the democratizing impulse. But then comes the second element in this idea, which is there was another weakness, which is the weakness of thought or of ideology. I just now claim that these two advances in agriculture and finance were instances of a general idea. The general idea is that the market order has no natural and necessary form. It has no singular expression. and it can be reinvented. So they reinvented it in practice, but it's as if, I want to say, they didn't know that they were reinventing it. And they never formulated the explicit theory of this reinvention. That's what you could call false consciousness, right? A failure to develop the doctrine of the legal indeterminacy of the market. So actually, in the later evolution of American legal thought, from the middle of the 19th century to the end of the 20th century, the American jurists discovered in practice that the market economy has no single natural and necessary form. For example, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. had this idea that if you take the abstractions of freedom of contract and private property and make them progressively more concrete, go down the ladder of concreteness, at each rung of the ladder, you'll have to make choices among one solution or another solution. For example, how will the relations of neighboring farmers to a stream of water that passes their land be regulated, upstream and downstream? And that the solutions given to these conflicts or alternatives will depend on contests of interests and of vision, of both. And you will not be able to infer the answer going back to the abstraction with which you began, of freedom of contract or private property. So, although they set out to demonstrate that the market order has a single natural and necessary form, they did the opposite. They discovered what Holmes and others discovered, there has no natural form. That doctrine, which I'm saying, they did not develop. So they had not only chained themselves, manacled themselves in an inadequate form of democracy, but they had failed to provide themselves with the necessary theoretical equipment. And that's the argument about why this impulse became progressively weaker in later moments in American history. Now, John, your commentary.
That's very good. So I want to show a couple slides that speak directly to that. There's a panic. So the 14th Amendment, by the end of the 19th century, comes to protect corporations rather than free people or industrial workers. And it really begins with, most of you law students will probably know this case, the Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. So it's after the spread of railroads to California. Santa Clara County have been taxing land and rights of way of the Southern Pacific Railroad. Southern Pacific Railroad refused to pay any taxes to the county for 6 years. And the railroad had property with a $30 million mortgage and refused to pay taxes of $30,000. So it's like having a $10,000 car and refusing to pay a $10 tax on it, and taking the case all the way up to the Supreme Court. The railroad did so in the hopes of obtaining protection from the 14th Amendment. The Southern Pacific lawyers argued that corporations, so a corporate form of organization, before the Civil War, it was very rare for it to, they were not that common, and the whole function of a corporation or of a corporate charter was for the benefit of the community, rather than for the benefit of a single corporation. After the war, the number of corporate charters are increased by a factor of at least tenfold after the Civil War to be used by corporations whose main goal is to generate wealth. Southern Pacific Railroad lawyers argued that the corporations are persons entitled to the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which states, as you all know, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Southern Pacific Railroad wins the case, and it establishes the precedent for corporations enjoying constitutional protections created by the nation's founders and radical Republicans during Reconstruction, which guaranteed to all citizens free speech and other civil liberties. So it raises the question, here's a Southern Pacific train. Who are legally persons in this photo? The train is legally a person, but so are the people.
Yeah, so in this there's like a fork in the road, right? There are two possibilities of development. One isn't even imagined. The other one was the one that prevails. So
Yes.
one fork in the road is there's this weakening of the dialectic between developmentalism on top and selective democratization below. And into this vacuum then, created by this weakening, steps the corporation.
Right.
In truth, the alliance of the corporation and high finance with the government,
Yes.
with the state.
Yes.
And the legal instrument is the corporation. Now, under traditional legal theory, the corporate charter, which provides limited liability for the owners, for the shareholders, is given in exchange for the implementation of a public purpose.
Right.
Huh?
Right. And that was in place.
So then that leads to this idea later, and we see even today, that the alternative to a free-for-all, quote, capitalism is responsible capitalism, pietistic capitalism. So, like the motto of the Harvard Business, the old motto of the Harvard Business School is,
Which was?
make profit with a conscience. So it's
When
this-
did that end?
I'm not sure, I don't know, but maybe it never ended de facto, but that was a sort of pietistic idea, right? That the owners and then the managers, speaking in the name of the owners, should be attentive to social needs as they are conventionally described by the political correctness of the day, right? And of course, then the objection could be, we don't want the rich people to determine what the public purpose is. The constraint should be determined by law. If you don't want the owners of the corporations just to maximize profit, force them to do something else by the legal framework. Don't make it depend on their pieties or their objectives. So that's one fork in the road, right? In which the choices between responsible capitalism and irresponsible capitalism. Now, if you ask me, what do I choose in that choice? I prefer irresponsible capitalism to responsible capitalism. But then there's the other fork in the road, which would have been to say, the corporation is just a legal instrument. It could be a legal instrument to accomplish two objectives. One objective is to organize this partnership with the government in continuing to build the country, right? The other objective is to democratize, to decentralize access to productive resources and opportunities, the democratization of the market order. The corporate form legally is just a box, a black box that has no intrinsic content. There's no need to develop it in the direction that it took. And that would have been the way in which the legal architecture of the late 19th century could have been used to perpetuate the dynamic of the early 19th century. But that's not what happened. For all the reasons that we know or can surmise of the forces that took control of American life in the late 19th century.
That's right. It was a huge transformation. Huge transformation.
So, and I think this raises methodological questions, which we really all contemporaries don't know how to answer. So, conventional industry, was mechanized manufacturing, which became Fordist mass production. The large-scale production of standardized goods and services with relatively rigid machines and production processes on the basis of semi-skilled labor and very hierarchical and specialized relations of production. So we know it in the form of a little industrial dictatorship, or sets of industrial dictatorships. Right? The worker in Adam Smith's pin factory or Henry Ford's assembly line works as if he were one of his machines. He mimics the repetitious movement of his machines. The whole structure of the workplace is a command and control structure, like an imitation of a traditional infantry brigade.
I was just going to say,
Yeah.
in fact, a lot of the CEOs or the heads of corporations saw the corporation model for a corporation after the war as a brigade, as a company.
So the question is it that way because it has to be that way? Is that the very nature technologically of industrial mass production? Or was it that way because the controlling interests in the society and the controlling visions led it in that direction? So that which of these is true? So that matters, because the conventional account in the United States coincides with the Marxist account and say it had to be that way. But one can question whether it had to be that way.
No question. It could have been different. It was, and the vast majority of corporate heads of CEOs from 1865 to 1890s had served in the military and survived the military. They went from being military leaders to corporate leaders.
So the first text that we assigned for today emphasized this way in which the Civil War was the forge in which this form of economic organization developed in the United States. And that was true throughout the world.
Yes.
War was the most congenial circumstance for the development of this kind of industrial organization.
That's right. And it's such that workers going on strike were seen as deserters in an army. And the punishment for desertion in the army was execution in both the North and the South in theory. So corporate heads didn't execute workers, they just, well, some of them did in the sense of calling in the Pinkertons if they wanted to strike and kill them. But it was, they self-consciously modeled the organizational structure of the military onto these new corporations.
So shall we say some more about the late 19th century, or because the next theme would be the New Deal and then the war economy?
Yeah, I mentioned the degree of
because in your commentary there was also commentary about the religious and cultural ideas
yes,
of evil, of sin,
yes,
as in the text by Mark Twain
yes,
and your essay about it.
yes. So the nature of evil and of sin changes after the Civil War. In one sense, there is no longer this belief that God or its equivalent is eminent and indwelling is more distant and has less influence or power both morally and from an individual perspective. So there's a there's a comparative decline or declension in how one understands God or its equivalent. And the best way to summarize it is that in the 1840s, especially in 1850s, and during the Civil War, both the North and the South believed that with God on their side, they would be victorious. And that God could interfere and affect the affairs of the world. And the degree of millennialist thought was extremely high, meaning that the second coming, that Christ would return and bring about this new dispensation.
Mm-hmm.
That was profound during the war. And following the war, in the sense that in the wake of this very fervent belief system in which this new dispensation is impending or at hand, when it doesn't occur, when it doesn't happen, there's this this move away, which a number of scholars have referred to as a kind of religious pragmatism.
Now, going back to the problem of whether industrial mass production had to become what it became.
Right.
So the premise would be, or the bias would be, that if there's an innovation in the world, like mechanized manufacturing, the tendency is for it to be implemented in the way that least disturbs the ruling interests and the established preconceptions. That's what you could call the path of least resistance. So the insular knowledge economy of today and hierarchical mass production are both examples of the path of least resistance. But there's the following enigma, which forgive me for mentioning, because I'm completely uncertain about it. So in the 19th century, the liberals and socialists wanted free labor to become self-employment and cooperation, right? Not wage labor. That is it was wage labor only began to be seen as the natural form and predominant form of free labor toward the end of the 19th century.
Yes, but I mean, so the socialists and the Wobblies, they believed in free labor, but they understood how the radical transformation of the market order. So they recognized the significance of having large numbers of laborers or workers within a corporation, but their main protest or form of protest was in the agency or voice that they had, both
Sure,
to a certain degree, socialists and Wobblies, who are the two main, by far the leading radical labor activists.
But the question is, how could a society of artisans preserve its decentralized and democratic nature in the age of industrial mass production?
They realized that was, they recognized that the artisanal ideal was no longer
valid in its original form.
That's right.
But the question is whether it could be reinvented in another form.
Yeah, so that's why they embraced the notion of essentially a true democratic form of a corporation, so that all workers, regardless of what your status is as worker, has an equal voice and an equal vote, the same vote and the same voice that the president or the management has.
That's not enough. I mean, that's like the Yugoslav system of the 20th century, right? Worker-owned and worker-managed enterprise.
But yes.
And the problem there is that some of these worker-owned and worker-managed businesses will prosper, others will fail.
Right.
Will you allow the ones that prosper to buy out the ones that fail, and then to consign their workers to a second-class status? In other words, you'll then have two classes, the worker owners and the workers who are just wage laborers for the worker, or will you prohibit this by restraint on accumulation and alienation? If you prohibit it, you condemn yourself to an egalitarian poverty.
That's right.
And if you don't prohibit it, then you have everything begin all over again. This was the problem that they weren't able to
That's
solve.
exactly right.
And to
That's exactly
solve
right.
it, they would have had to reinvent the property regime.
Yes.
You know, and could they reinvent it? Is that a realistic demand? Because remember the thought experiment, which I think came in earlier class. Imagine a system in which the means of production are not owned by anyone. The major means of production, liquid capital and technological apparatus, are vested in social funds under the watch of the democratic institutions. And these social funds conduct a rotating auction of the capital resources of society.
Correct.
So anyone can bid to borrow these productive resources so long as they can assure the fund of providing the highest rate of return. If you bid them and I come along and say I can give the fund a higher rate of return, I take them away from you. Now, what is that system? That's a market order because it's decentralized, but it relativizes the absolute and perpetual character of the property right. So it radicalizes decentralization by relativizing absolute control. And I would call that system capitalism without capitalists,
That's right.
facetiously. Huh?
Yes.
So both conceptually and practically, is it reasonable to expect that the society and the culture of the 19th century could have moved in that direction? I don't say leapt in one step to that idea, but taken that trajectory.
I think.
Because a Marxist or a practical entrepreneur would say that was never possible. So it's like saying you don't develop the doctrinal apparatus, the apparatus of ideas, until you are in fact able to use it. And they could not use such ideas even if they had them. That would be the contrary thesis. And what's the correct view?
It's a great question. It's a great question. I think it would have been easier to implement it in the U.S. than in European countries, simply because of the land mass, the percentage.
Scale.
The scale. And
Scale.
So, yes.
But also because in the European countries, the oligarchic element was more pronounced, culturally as well as socially.
Although by the late 19th century, in politics had become quasi-oligarchical. So in other words, another way of saying that is that by 1900, the notion that someone like Lincoln could have been elected president would have been far less possible. I mean, Lincoln. He's completely unknown on a national level. Completely unknown until 1858. Period. He was. There are a number of specific contexts and reasons why he was elected. In fact, one is that the Republican Party was so terrifying to Southerners that the Southern Democrats walked out of Stephen Douglas's Democratic Party because they essentially said they couldn't trust any Northerner. So the 1860 election was a four-way race: a Southern Democratic candidate, a Northern Democratic candidate, and Lincoln. And had it been simply a Democrat versus Republican, Lincoln probably would have lost. So there's a lot going on, but I think that someone like a Lincoln, the ability, the chances of that person being elected in 1900 or 1920 would have been far, far less.
Now, do you want to tell us about the New Deal?
Yeah, we can both. So the New Deal establishes and creates reforms in legislation that limit the power of corporation. They lessen the exploitation on workers. They formalize a labor system. And it's really the first time in which they provide handouts to very poor people. But the government, the federal government, hires workers so that they can support themselves and live. They also pass legislation that limits the power of corporations and give more power to labor unions. So labor becomes much more efficient and effective at challenging the corporate executives or the corporation.
So there's a practical political question, which I think is a good place to begin. It's very common now for American progressives to idealize or sentimentalize the New Deal.
Right.
The New Deal was paradise compared to what things are like now in politics.
Right.
You know? So what's your view of that?
I disagree with that. I think that essentially since FDR's New Deal policies, some form of the New Deal has persisted to the present. Some form. Before the New Deal, if you were poor and had no money, there were no handouts at all from the government. Zero. It was truly Darwinian.
So the dominant idea in the United States among American progressives for some time seems to be that what is desirable is that the United States should become the Sweden of the 1970s. And the New Deal is the thing that's closest to the
Yes.
Sweden of the 1970s
Yes.
in American history.
Yes, it is.
Meaning a focus on entitlements, on security, on antidotes to economic insecurity.
Yes. Not for everyone, but for some. Yes.
With no further alteration or democratization of the market order itself.
That's correct.
The market is what it is.
Yes.
It creates these dangers, this insecurity.
Yes.
Will safeguard the workers, the mass of
Yes.
asset-less people against these dangers.
Yes, that's right, that's exactly right. So that, as I said, that's the example of it persisting. There's also protection for people before the New Deal, before FDR. There was no protection for people who had money in banks. In fact, if a bank went bankrupt, whatever money that you had in there was gone. There was zero protection.
So, but the question is whether the focus on economic security should be the main focus now, as opposed to the idea that now the task is to democratize the market order, and especially to give a socially inclusive character to the new vanguard, which is the market economy.
Right.
And
Right.
the idea of restabilization and security is not enough. Therefore, it is a mistake of the contemporary Americans to idealize the New Deal and to find there that they should have like a second act, a second coming of the New Deal.
That's right. That tends to be the progressive vision of the New Deal, which is profoundly limited.
So I would say, from my perspective, you could take, let's say, the long New Deal, from the coming of Roosevelt to power to the aftermath of the Second World War.
Right.
There, you could distinguish 4 moments. So the first moment is the early institutional experimentation, which Roosevelt temperamentally was a radical experimentalist.
Yes.
And he said so.
Yes.
I want to try anything out. And he heard a wide range of voices and so forth. And that was from the beginning of 1932 to the middle of 33. It was a comparatively short period. Now, look into the content of this institutional experimentalism. What was the content? The content was actually very similar to the ideas also available in Europe at that time, even for the fascist and Nazi regimes. And there were 2 themes. The first theme was direct employment of labor by the state. If the corporations wouldn't employ them, the state would, through labor fronts or through regional development authorities like the Tennessee Valley Authority. That was one theme, the state as the employer of last resort. The second theme was the restabilization of the economy by managed competition. It wasn't the democratization of the market, much less the radicalization of competition. It was the opposite. It was the organization, it was limiting competition because so-called cutthroat competition was supposed to be an evil. And so they were quasi-oligopolies organized by the government in concert with private business, which in today's vocabulary we would describe as corporatism. That's the term that political science today would use to describe these institutional experiments. The instrument was the National Recovery Administration, which the Supreme Court later judged to be unconstitutional and was replaced. But the central principle was this principle of collusion or concerted action between government and big business. So let's say that's the first stage. Then the second stage, from the middle of 33 on, is the narrowing of the focus to the provision of antidotes to economic insecurity. And there were, the principal antidotes were the Social Security program, which became the most persistent achievement of the New Deal, and the Glass-Steagall Act, which divided the financial organizations that were engaged in proprietary trading from those that dealt with federally deposited, federally insured deposits.
Right, separated finance from banking.
That's right. So it was the insecurity of unemployment or old age and the insecurity of bank runs. So that's this narrowing funnel. Then the third moment, but there was an exception. There was one area where the institutional experimentalism persisted, and that was the housing market. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the formation of these quasi-governmental entities, which later then became the mainstay for the deepening of the capital market in the United States. This is what was the basis for financial markets were these institutional innovations in the housing market, which if on one side democratized access to housing, on the other side provided the capital for the financial markets. So that was the second moment. Third moment was the war. We'll come back to that later, so let me skip over that. And then the fourth moment is after the war, consumption, the democratization of consumption, which
And the celebration of consumption.
the celebration of consumption, a style of economic growth led by the popularization of purchasing power in a country which was soon to experiment a radical increase of inequality. How were they going to square this circle? We mentioned that the other day, and we'll come back to it next week. So those are the three moments of the New Deal. I skipped over the third moment, which was the war economy. And the war economy was a remarkable exception. But before coming back to the war economy, let me return to the initial provocation. Is this a good model for the American progressives today? And I would say it's not. Because
But that's what most progressives went back to.
that's what they went back to. But actually, they didn't go back to that because the Democratic Party never later formulated a sequel to the New Deal, right? Instead of that, instead it went to, so the characteristic later achievements were Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, right? Which was followed the bad advice of the economists in targeting transfers to poor people. So Roosevelt's attitude was the conventional social democratic attitude. The transfers, the antidotes to insecurity, should be in the interest of the broad working class majority of the country. If you have a targeted policy, it's going to be vulnerable to any downswing of the political and economic cycle, right? What you want is for the poor to be lifted up in the wave that takes forward the broad working class majority, right? Which the war on poverty was the opposite of that. And then identity politics, which you all know about, which then was the interruption of this whole program. In fact, Roosevelt was accused of sacrificing the interests of civil rights to the acceptance of his New Deal agenda by the Democratic Party in the South, right? So it's not a good model. It's a bad model. It's the wrong model, I want to say.
But it's
aggressively.
it's the primary model by which most progressives
Understand their success and failure today. Huh? So,
And the other thing that Roosevelt did is legitimate labor unions in a way that.
yes. So do you want to say something more about the New Deal, John? Or?
It was, and the other thing that it did is to provide protection for bank failures.
Yes, we spoke about that, the Glass-Steagall Act and so forth.
So, yes, so part of the I guess, I think it's fair to say both of our agenda is to look beyond the model of the New Deal
To something else.
to something else.
Yeah.
And what might be that something else.
Yes,
And
indeed.
how would it manifest? What would be the architecture
Yeah.
of a replacement of the New Deal?
Yes. And now let me just say one word about the war economy, because that, after all, is a remarkable episode in American history. So it was like an interval. It was an interlude in which everything was done differently. And based on a combination of massive mobilization of resources, financial, economic, human, and radical institutional experimentation. So for the 3 or 4 years of the war, the Americans discarded their free market ideology as if they had never believed in it, as if it were just there for convenience, it was an illusion, and they ran the economy on a completely different principle. So, first of all, the massive resource mobilization, the volume of military procurements in 1940, in the first 6 months of 1942 was higher than the total GDP of the United States in 1941. So this is massive mobilization of resources. Huh? And now comes the institutional experimentation. How was the country run? It was run by a free-floating entente between the federal government and big business through devices like the War Production Board, the Office of Price Administration, the Manpower Commission, which allocated labor here and there. Everything, the complete negation of the supposed free market dogmas of the United States. It was done the opposite. And almost effortlessly, there was an idea at the time, the Congress had the idea of bringing small business into the picture, and that really didn't work. It was the Small Enterprise War Program. So it was this relation between big business and the government. A free-floating coordination, basically without rules or sort of external rules. That was how the economy moved. And the result was sensational. In 4 years, the GDP of the United States more than doubled under this system.
Yes.
Huh?
I mean, it's very similar to how Lincoln ran his war economy. He does the same thing with at a much smaller scale.
Yeah.
When Southerners bomb Fort Sumter, the Union has virtually no ships. And so he contracts with shipbuilders to build countless ships. Same with weapons, same with uniforms, same with everything.
But it shows something deep about the country and the society, because one of the strong suits of the United States is demonstrated its ability to cooperate across class lines, across racial lines, when it needed to. And there are many societies which don't have that capacity.
Both Lincoln and FDR integrated the Navy at the beginning of each war.
Mm-hmm.
At the beginning of each war. Conventionally, the war economy is treated as if it were a total anomaly, without any significance for the peacetime economy, as if there were no lessons for the running of the peace. But how can there be no lessons? If they doubled GDP in 3 or 4 years, and they produce this so it leads to the idea is, can there be a war economy without a war? Huh? Because that would be economic growth with a vengeance, right? Obviously, the war economy has unique features which couldn't be reproduced, because there's guaranteed supply by the producers and there's guaranteed demand by the state, which radically simplifies the economic equation. Nevertheless, the ability to do this in practice in a vast country, to produce twice as much as necessary to do anything, and to win the war by simple, quantitative, overwhelming mass. It's fantastic. It's an incredible achievement. To take advantage of all of the resources that the nation has.
Yes.
And it's only happened twice, really, in our history.
Yeah.
And Lincoln really does very much the same thing on a smaller scale, comparatively smaller scale, and but it was successful. It was foundational.
So this episode of the war economy in the structure of our conversation here today goes back to the beginning of the conversation, because it goes back to the theme in the early republic of the relation between the national developmentalism on top and the selective democratization, which would be the institutional experimentation of that time below. Huh? And here we have it in the war economy in a starkly simplified form with dramatic results.
So the question, can can the nation, can we create a perpetual?
A
what we're talking
simulacrum
about,
of this
simulacrum,
perpetual
yes.
high-level
That's right.
mobilization,
Yes.
radical institutional experimentation, outside the artificial or highly special conditions of the war.
That's right. Is that possible? Then you've articulated your architecture for that happening.
So I think we should, the class has been silent, let's
Yeah, you've been
let's
very
ask to
silent.
engage.
Questions, comments, criticisms,
Propositions.
propositions? Addendums? Yes.
It's a pretty general question, but in the first class, we talked about radical experimentation and what that would look like on a state basis. And FDR was sort of like you were saying, the first one to really start to implement these pretty radical progressive ideas at the federal level. Do you think that this provides an effective model for general radical change on a federal level, or is it a
No,
lesson
let me
not?
question your idea. So you say he was genuinely a radical experimentalist, but that doesn't mean that his experiments were as radical as he wanted them to be. They weren't. Because this is the problem of the politicians. The politicians imagine that when they need ideas, the ideas will appear. In other words, the only problem is the problem of practical constraint, of opposing interests. This is completely false. Ideas are very difficult to form. And they don't appear when you need them. It's like King Lear. Or you can call the spirits, but will they come? They won't come. So the ideas that Roosevelt implemented in his first year and a half of supposedly radical experimentalism were, as I said, almost identical. For example, they were identical to the economic ideas of the Hitler regime in its first years, although no contemporary American wants to hear that. But that's the fact. The corporatist restabilization of the economy, the state acting as employer of last resort, all of this was the stuff of what was happening in Europe. So you have to have a doctrine, you have to have a project. And the ideas that are available at any given time in the world form a relatively inelastic repertoire, right? And it's very hard. And how do you expand them? So one of the uses of federalism or of relations between the central power and states and municipalities would be precisely to generate these ideas. You say, the country goes down a certain path, but as it goes down a certain path, it hedges its bets by allowing parts of itself to deviate from the predominant solution and to provide a counter-model of the national future. That's one of the ways in which you would increase the stock of ideas. Because after all, for a public idea to be powerful, it has to be embodied in actual examples. It can't just be a set of abstractions.
And Roosevelt had the wherewithal and the power to implement those abstract, at that time, seemingly abstract ideas, as Lincoln did. Yes.
Professor Armour, when you talk about capitalism not being controlled just by the capitalist and having a free flow of capital infusion controlled by not just individuals or corporate entities, would you envision something like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac loaning not just for houses, but organizations like that, loaning for capital formation to be divvied out to the person?
It
who
could be.
has
I
the
mean,
they can use?
sure. I mean, you could take them as one of possible starting points for this idea of the rotating capital auction, right? So first of all, on your allusion to the concept of capitalism, I don't believe in this concept of capitalism, right? Because the idea of capitalism presupposes the Marxist conception that the market order does have a natural and necessary form. As Karl Marx believed the same thing that Hayek believed, that, you know, there are these regimes. One of these regimes is this market system, capitalism, and it's a package which comes with its content. So you buy the package, you are the package, you open it up, and the content is already predetermined. I don't believe that. I don't believe that the market order has a natural form. Therefore, strictly speaking, we shouldn't even use the concept capitalism. We should speak about different kinds of market orders. And one of the characteristics of and there's this paradox about Marxism, right? The leftists in the world no longer believe in the heroic assumptions of Marxist social theory, that there's a small menu of regimes, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, so forth, that each of them is an indivisible system. So when they change, so that generates a binary idea of politics. You either have the reformist management of a system or the revolutionary substitution of one system by another. And then there are laws governing the foreordained succession of these systems in history. So the second idea, the idea of the indivisibility, leads to this false binary view of politics. It's false because structural change, when it happens, is always fragmentary. And the idea of total change is a limiting case. It's an unrealistic limiting case. The first and the third idea, that there's a small a limited menu of options, and that there are laws, leads to the notion that we can't have a project, because history has a project for us, right? It's the project so that's all false. Now, what happens in the world is that the leftists in general no longer believe in this theory, Marxist theory. But they continue to use the vocabulary of the theory, even though all the crucial concepts only have a clear meaning in the context of the theory. And this leads to this huge confusion in which they say they want things that they don't really want, or they want something else and so forth. So we should, to the extent that we can, stay out of this, but it requires a combination of theoretical purity and practical radicalism, which is a tall order.
Yeah, combining the two,
Yes, yeah.
integrating those two is crucial, and that is, it's a tall order.
But I think on your substantive question, yes. You know, the thought experiment that I gave of a capital auction could have many practical starting points in the world such as it exists, including the one you mentioned, the quasi-governmental organizations that the New Deal created could be converted to another purpose.
The Homestead Act that Lincoln created could be converted to another purpose.
Of course, because now in the age of the knowledge economy, we have a task which is equivalent to the task of this agricultural extension, right? So we have this vanguard. The vanguard is quarantined in these little islands of the knowledge economy. Instead of spreading, the opposite is happening. The elites that own it and control it are discovering a way to bifurcate the process of production between the lucrative, creative, fun part, which they keep for themselves, and the routinized, commoditized part that they subcontract to firms and workers in other parts of the world with lower tax take and lower wage, labor and tax arbitrage. So the prospect for socially inclusive economic growth, which is in general what the world says it wants, depends on our ability to take this knowledge economy and disseminate it economy-wide, outside of its islands, to create a knowledge economy for the many that can replace the knowledge economy for the few. And the very first step of that is then an attempt to imitate the project of the 19th century with respect to the uplift of all the people who are back in the rear guard. So now the situation in the United States is there's this elite that is in the vanguard of the knowledge economy. The elite is serviced by these paper pushers of the lawyers and the management consultants and so forth, the accountants, and everyone else who's not in this elite or not in the providers of service is back doing some kind of make work in the rear guard. And there are two categories in particular. So there's the small and medium-sized firms, the vast majority of them pushed backward to a world of small shops, including industrial shops and commercial shops, isolated and archaic family business. And the second group are the multitude of autonomous economic agents, service providers, which we have in the whole world. Now, a large percentage of them under conditions of precarious employment with very low productivity. So the question is, how can you begin to lift up this mass of people in the rear guard and bring them closer to the frontier of productivity? That's the task of the state, operating in concert with allies in civil society and the market. So that's the first moment. And there are many experiments in the world which are already in some way trying to do this. Way there in the future, the third moment would be this moment of the radicalization of access to productive resources and opportunities as through the rotating capital fund. And there's lots of stuff in between. So that would be the general character of the transformation. And what it plays to is this widespread desire in humanity, in much of the world, to be enhanced, empowered as agents, and not simply safeguarded or co-opted as beneficiaries. That's what they want. That's what everyone wants. Taxed. And not just to receive the protection against the storm. The protection against the storm is necessary. But the problem of historical social democracy is that it has all of this talk about the haven, but it has no talk about the storm. We want the haven so that we can thrive and move in the storm. And the storm doesn't occur spontaneously, the storm of innovation and conflict. The storm has to be arranged. And it has institutional requirements. And that's then what leads to this discussion.
Other questions, comments? Yes.
How does the rotating capital option, let's say, how is that distinguishable from well-functioning capital markets? You have small businesses.
Yeah, this is a paradox about this idea, of course. Because what a contemporary financier or finance theorist would say is that that's what already happens. Because supposedly, if there's a perfectly competitive capital market, it already allocates resources to its most productive uses. So we don't need this rotating capital fund. It's the idealization of the reality. If there's a flaw, a competitive flaw is supposed to be localized. That is, the dominant ideas deny that you can have different ways of organizing a capital market, that some of them will bring finance capital and production closer, and others will keep them further apart. They'll say, if it's perfectly competitive, it will always automatically bring resources to the most competitive use. That's what they say already happens. So if in one sense this thought experiment of the capital auction seems radical and utopian, from another angle, from the angle of this orthodox theory, it's supposedly what already happens. But does it already happen? We deny that, or I deny that. And in a sense, this capital auction would test whether the outcome would be different. But I think it's not the idea that all capital would be allocated this way. Because as I think I mentioned in an earlier class, the traditional absolute unified property right has an advantage. The advantage is that it allows someone, the owner, to do at his own risk and with his own resources something that no one else believes in. So we would always, without having to negotiate with some range of stakeholders. So we would always want that to be part of the system. But why would we want that to be the only part of the system? And to be the only way in which access to capital is democratized or decentralized? That's what doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Another question about the rotating capital auction.
Yeah.
Having worked with a lot of nonprofits outside of here, I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how auctioning resources in this way might pervert the incentives and focus of the corporations or organizations or what have you that would be seeking it in terms of just
I think, but I'm not sure why nonprofits would be relevant to this. So
because because a lot of them are significantly funded via federal grants that they have to seek. So a lot of resources in these organizations end up going toward actually just perpetuating the organization itself rather
you
than
mean because the
providing
nonprofits, the
services.
finance comes from the world that would otherwise go into production? Is that the idea?
I don't know if I'm totally following what you're saying.
No, because I just don't understand why this is a discussion about, because it seems to me that the nonprofits are relevant to another similar but different discussion, which is the participation of civil society together with the state in the provision of public services, right? That's where, because the only model that we have in the world of provision of public services is what you would call an administrative Fordism. Fordism in the sense of standardized mass production. So the model that we have in the world of public services is the provision of low quality, standardized public services, of lower quality than the equivalent services that can be bought in the market by someone with money. That's the model we have. We have no model of the provision of public services that is the equivalent to the knowledge economy in public services. And what you could say is that there is an alternative. The only apparent alternative is the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms. But the better alternative is to imagine the state provides a universal floor, a universal minimum. And the state operates also at the ceiling in the financing and development of the costliest and most complex public services. But in the broad middle zone between the floor and the ceiling, the state partners with independent civil society, including the nonprofits, in the experimentalist provision of public services. And civil society participates, for example, through cooperatives of health professionals or educators, as the partner of the state. So the state provides the funding, the state monitors, the state coordinates, the state checks and orchestrates, but public services are the way in which civil society creates its own future. Shouldn't it be engaged in the creation of its own future? That would be the great way in which civil society could participate outside the market. That's not an idea about the market, that's an idea about something else. I think
We're out of time.
we're out of time.
We can continue this discussion over
But
the next.
next time, the discussion is on the contemporary economy,
Exactly.
right?
Well,
The political economy after the war, in the late 20th
Yes,
century,
yes.
and now at the beginning of the 21st century. Now,
So we can continue this discussion.
discuss, exactly.
Exactly.